The train whistle echoed across the empty platform as Margaret Sullivan watched the black smoke disappear into the afternoon sky. Her hands shook as she gripped the handle of her worn leather suitcase, the only possession she had left in the world. The September air was crisp in Millbrook, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Just 20 minutes ago, she thought her new life was beginning. She had stepped off that same train with hope in her heart and butterflies in her stomach. After months of letters back and forth, she was finally going to meet Thomas Crawford, the man who had promised to marry her and give her a home out west. But everything went wrong the moment she saw him waiting on the platform. Thomas was a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes and a permanent frown. When Margaret approached him with a nervous smile, he looked her up and down like she was a horse he was thinking about buying. His face showed nothing but disappointment. "You're Margaret Sullivan?" he asked, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "Yes." "Mr. Crawford, I'm so pleased to finally meet you," she had replied, trying to sound cheerful despite the sinking feeling in her chest. Thomas shook his head slowly. "This won't work. You're not what I expected at all." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I don't understand. We've been writing to each other for months? You said you were looking forward to our marriage?" "That was before I saw you," Thomas said bluntly. "I thought you'd be younger, prettier, more useful looking." The words hit Margaret like a slap across the face. She was only 24 years old, but the hard years after her parents died had left their mark. Her brown hair was simple and practical, not fancy like the rich ladies in the magazines. Her dress was clean but old, mended in several places. But she had always thought she looked pleasant enough. "Mr. Crawford, please," Margaret tried again. "I can work hard. I can cook and clean and help with anything you need. I just need a chance to show you." But Thomas was already walking away. He stopped and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small handful of coins. He threw them at her feet without looking back. "There's $5. That should get you back where you came from." And then he was gone, leaving Margaret standing alone on the platform with everyone staring at her. The other passengers from the train had already been met by their families or had walked into town. The station master had gone inside his little office. Margaret was completely alone. She bent down and picked up the coins with trembling fingers. $5 wasn't enough to get her back to Boston, even if she wanted to go. And she couldn't go back anyway. There was nothing left for her there. Her parents were dead, their small house sold to pay their debts. She had no family, no friends who could help her. Coming west as a mail-order bride had been her only option for survival. Now, what was she supposed to do? Margaret sat down heavily on the wooden bench beside the train platform. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and she could feel the temperature dropping. She had nowhere to sleep tonight. No food except for the small piece of bread in her bag. No plan at all. She closed her eyes and tried not to cry. Crying wouldn't help anything. She had learned that lesson when her mother died of fever 2 years ago. And again when her father died in the factory accident last winter. Tears didn't change anything. They just made you weak. But sitting there on that lonely bench, Margaret felt more hopeless than she ever had before. At least when her parents died, she still had their little house to live in, even if it was just for a few months. She had neighbors who knew her, even if they couldn't help much. Here in Millbrook, she was a complete stranger. She didn't even know if there was a hotel in town or if she could afford one. If there was, the sound of boots on the wooden platform made her look up. 2 young men were walking toward her. They looked like they might be brothers, both tall and lean with dark hair and serious faces. They were probably in their early 20s, just a few years younger than Margaret herself. One of them, who had a small scar on his chin, spoke first. "Excuse me, miss. Are you all right?" Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and tried to look composed. "I'm fine, thank you." The other brother, who was slightly taller, looked concerned. "We couldn't help but notice what happened with Thomas Crawford. We saw him leave you here." Margaret felt her cheeks turn red again. "You saw that?" "We were waiting to pick up supplies from the train," the first brother explained. "We know Thomas pretty well, and we've seen him do this before. Do what before? Margaret asked, confused. Leave his mail-order brides at the station, the taller brother said. You're not the first woman he's rejected after getting her hopes up. Margaret stared at them in shock. He's done this to other women? At least 3 times that we know of, the brother with the scar said. Thomas likes the idea of having a wife, but he always finds some excuse when they actually arrive. Usually, he keeps whatever money they brought with them too. But I didn't bring any money, Margaret said. I spent everything I had on the train ticket to get here. The 2 brothers looked at each other, and Margaret could see them having some kind of silent conversation. Finally, the taller one spoke up, "Miss, what's your name?" Margaret Sullivan. I'm Samuel Hayes, and this is my twin brother Benjamin. We have a proposition for you. Margaret looked at them suspiciously. After what had just happened with Thomas, she wasn't ready to trust any man's proposition. What kind of proposition? It's about our father, Benjamin said. He's been alone for 3 years now, ever since our mother passed away. The ranch is struggling, and honestly, so is he. We think he needs a companion, Samuel added. Someone to help bring some life back to our home, Margaret frowned. Are you asking me to be your father's mail-order bride instead? Not exactly, Benjamin said quickly. We're asking if you'd be willing to meet him, to see if maybe you 2 might suit each other. If things work out, you'd have a home and security. If they don't, well, we have a small cabin on our property that could be yours anyway. Margaret looked back and forth between the 2 brothers. They seemed sincere, but she had thought Thomas was sincere too, at least in his letters. Why would you make such an offer to a complete stranger? She asked. Samuel shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Because we're desperate, he said honestly. Our father is a good man, but he's been lost since our mother died. He barely talks to us anymore. He doesn't take care of himself. The ranch work that used to come easy to him is getting harder because his heart isn't in it. And because you need help too, Benjamin added, looking at Margaret's thin shawl and worn dress. Thomas Crawford is a fool, but his foolishness might be our family's good fortune if you're willing to give us a chance. Margaret looked out at the empty train tracks, then back at the 2 young men. The sun was almost setting now, and she could feel the evening chill settling in. She had exactly $5 to her name and nowhere to go. What's your father's name? She asked. Jacob Hayes, Samuel said. He's 45 years old, and he runs a cattle ranch about an hour's ride from town. And you think he'd want to meet? May? The brothers looked at each other again. He doesn't know we're asking, Benjamin admitted. But we think once he meets you, he might change his mind about staying alone forever. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. It was a risk, but then again, everything was a risk now. At least these brothers were being honest about their situation, which was more than Thomas Crawford had done. If I come with you, she said slowly, and your father doesn't want me there, what then? Then we'll bring you back to town and help you figure out what to do next, Samuel promised. You have our word on that. Margaret looked at her suitcase, then at the $5 in her hand, then at the 2 brothers who were waiting patiently for her answer. The smart thing might be to say no, to try to find some other solution. But what other solution was there? All right, she said, standing up and picking up her suitcase. I'll meet your father. The wagon ride to the Hayes Ranch took longer than Margaret expected. Samuel drove while Benjamin sat beside her in the back, making polite conversation about the weather and the countryside. Margaret tried to focus on what they were saying, but her mind kept racing with worry about what she was getting herself into, the landscape around. Millbrook was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Rolling hills stretched out in every direction, covered with tall grass that swayed in the evening breeze. Scattered oak trees dotted the horizon, and in the distance, Margaret could see mountains rising up against the darkening sky. It was so different from the crowded streets and tall buildings of Boston. Our ranch is just over that hill, Benjamin said, pointing ahead. We've got about 200 acres of grazing land and a good water source from the creek that runs through the property. It sounds lovely, Margaret replied. Though she was more nervous than excited, Samuel looked back at them from the driver's seat. We should probably tell you more about our father before we get there, he said, so you know what to expect. Margaret nodded, grateful for any information that might help her understand the situation better. Pa wasn't always so quiet and closed. Benjamin began. Before Ma died, he was different. He used to laugh a lot, especially at dinner time when Ma would tell stories about her day. He'd help her in the kitchen sometimes, and they'd dance together in the parlor on Sunday evenings. He taught us how to rope cattle and mend fences, Samuel added. He was patient with us even when we made mistakes. He always said that's how you learn. Margaret could hear the sadness in their voices when they talked about the past. What happened to your mother? She asked gently. Pneumonia, Benjamin said quietly. It came on real sudden during a bad winter. One day she was fine, helping us with the morning chores. A week later, she was gone. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. Pa blamed himself. Said he should have gotten the doctor sooner, should have done more to keep her warm. Nothing we said could convince him it wasn't his fault. After the funeral, he just changed. Benjamin continued. He stopped talking much, except when he had to give us orders about the ranch work. He stopped coming to church on Sundays. Ma's chair at the dinner table has been empty for 3 years, but he won't let us move it or even dust it off. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for this man she hadn't even met yet. She knew what it was like to lose people you loved. And you think he might be willing to remarry after all this time? The brothers exchanged another one of their silent looks. Honestly, Samuel said, we don't know. But we can't keep watching him fade away like this. He's only 45 years old. He's got years of life ahead of him, if he'll just let himself live them. The ranch is suffering too, Benjamin added. Pa used to keep detailed records of everything. Which cattle were ready for market, when to plant the hay, how much feed we'd need for winter. Now he just goes through the motions. Last month we almost lost a dozen head of cattle because he forgot to check on them during a storm. Margaret was starting to understand why the twins were so worried. A man who couldn't focus on his work was dangerous on a ranch, both to himself and to the animals he was supposed to care for. What makes you think I could help? She asked. I don't know anything about cattle or ranch life. It's not about the ranch work, Samuel said. It's about bringing some life back into our house. Right now it feels more like a tomb than a home. Ma used to fill the house with good smells from her cooking, Benjamin said with a wistful smile. She'd hum while she worked, and she always had some project going, mending clothes, tending her flower garden, writing letters to her sister back east. The house felt alive when she was in it. Now it's just quiet, Samuel said, too quiet. We eat our meals in silence. We go to bed early because there's nothing else to do. And Pa spends most evenings just staring into the fire, Margaret tried to imagine what that kind of grief must be like. When her own parents died, she had been devastated, but she'd also been busy trying to survive. She hadn't had the luxury of sitting still and dwelling on her loss. Maybe that had been a blessing in disguise. What if your father gets angry at you for bringing me there without asking him first? She asked. He probably will be angry, Benjamin admitted. But we're hoping that once he meets you, once he sees that we're not trying to replace Ma but just trying to help him move forward, he might understand. And if he doesn't, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Samuel said firmly. But we had to try something. We can't just watch him waste away for the rest of his life. The wagon crested a small hill, and suddenly Margaret could see the Hayes Ranch spread out below them. It was bigger than she had expected, with a large 2-story house, a red barn, several smaller outbuildings, and fenced pastures that seemed to go on forever. Cattle dotted the fields, and she could see the creek Benjamin had mentioned winding through the property like a silver ribbon. It's beautiful, Margaret said, and she meant it. Ma designed the house herself, Benjamin said proudly. She wanted big windows so she could see the mountains while she worked in the kitchen. And she insisted on a front porch with rocking chairs so she could sit outside in the evenings. As they got closer, Margaret could see that the property, while beautiful, showed signs of neglect. The fence posts needed repair in several places. Weeds were growing up around the house, and some of the outbuildings look like they could use fresh paint. "There's Pa," Samuel said, pointing toward the barn. Margaret looked and saw a tall, broad-shouldered man leading a horse toward the building. Even from a distance, she could see that he moved like someone carrying a heavy burden. His shoulders were slumped, and his steps seemed slow and deliberate. "Remember?" Benjamin said quietly as they approached the house. "He's a good man underneath. All that sadness, he just needs time to get used to the idea." Samuel pulled the wagon up to the front porch and jumped down to help Margaret with her suitcase. As her feet touched the ground, she took a deep breath and tried to calm her nerves. This was either going to be the beginning of a new life for her or another crushing disappointment. The front door of the house opened, and Jacob Hayes stepped out onto the porch. He was taller than Margaret had expected, with dark hair that was starting to turn gray at the temples and deep brown eyes that looked tired and weary. His clothes were clean but well worn, and she could see calluses on his hands from years of hard work. When he saw Margaret standing there with her suitcase, his expression changed from confusion to something that might have been anger. "Boys," he said, his voice low and controlled. "What's going on here?" Samuel and Benjamin looked at each other nervously, and Margaret realized that this conversation was about to determine the course of her entire future. "Pa," Samuel said, "we'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Sullivan. She's had some troubles today, and we thought maybe she could stay with us for a while." Jacob's eyes moved from his sons to Margaret, taking in her simple dress, her worn suitcase, and the nervous expression on her face. Margaret could practically see him putting the pieces together, and she knew from the way his jaw tightened that he wasn't pleased with what he was figuring out. "Is that so?" Jacob said, his voice getting colder. "And what kind of troubles might those be?" Margaret realized that if she wanted any chance of making this work, she needed to speak for herself. She straightened her shoulders and looked Jacob directly in the eyes. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I came to Millbrook to marry Thomas Crawford, but he changed his mind when he saw me. Your sons found me at the train station with nowhere to go, and they offered to help. I know this is awkward, but I'm grateful for their kindness." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret held her breath, waiting for his response. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as Jacob Hayes studied her face. His dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, but there was a coldness in them that made her want to step backward. She forced herself to stand still and meet his gaze. Finally, Jacob spoke. "Thomas Crawford rejected you, so my sons thought they'd bring you here like some kind of consolation prize." The words stung, but Margaret kept her voice steady. That's not how they presented it to me, Mr. Hayes." "Pa, that's not fair," Samuel said, stepping forward. "We were trying to help both of you." Jacob's attention snapped to his sons, and Margaret could see the anger building in his expression. "Help me by bringing a strange woman to my home without asking? By thinking you know what's best for me?" "We're worried about you," Benjamin said quietly. "We have been for a long time." "I don't need your worry," Jacob said sharply. "And I certainly don't need you boys playing matchmaker behind my back." Margaret watched this family argument unfold and felt her heart sinking. She could see the pain in the twins' faces as their father rejected their attempt to help him. She could also see something else in Jacob's eyes, not just anger, but fear. He was afraid of what they were asking him to do. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret sighed, interrupting the tense moment. "I understand this is uncomfortable for everyone. I never meant to cause problems between you and your sons." Jacob turned back to her, his expression still cold. "My sons are young and they think they understand things they don't. They mean well, but they've put us all in an impossible situation." "It doesn't have to be impossible," Margaret said carefully. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I just need a place to stay until I can figure out what to do next. If that makes you uncomfortable, I'll find somewhere else to go." "With what money?" Jacob asked bluntly. "Samuel told me Thomas only gave you $5. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She hadn't realized the twins had shared that detail with their father. "I'll find a way to manage." Jacob studied her for another long moment. Margaret could practically see him weighing his options, trying to decide what to do with this unwanted problem that had landed on his doorstep. "Can you cook?" he asked suddenly. The question caught Margaret off guard. "Yes, sir, I can cook and clean and sew. I kept house for my parents before they died." "And you're not afraid of hard work?" "No, sir, I've worked hard my whole life." Jacob nodded slowly, then looked at his sons. "You boys realize what you've done here, don't you? You've put Miss Sullivan in a position where she has to depend on the charity of strangers because she has nowhere else to go." Samuel and Benjamin looked uncomfortable, but Samuel spoke up. "We thought if you two met, maybe ... maybe what?" Jacob demanded. "Maybe I'd fall in love at first sight and solve all our problems. Maybe I'd forget about your mother and replace her with someone I just met." "That's not what we meant," Benjamin said desperately. "We just thought maybe you could be friends. Maybe you could help each other." Jacob's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Help each other? Miss Sullivan needs a home and security. I need—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I don't need anything, except for people to leave me alone." Margaret had heard enough. She picked up her suitcase and took a step toward the wagon. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said to the twins, "but I can see this isn't going to work. Could you please take me back to town?" "Wait," Jacob said, and something in his voice made her stop. "Where will you go? What will you do?" Margaret turned back to face him. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'll figure something out. I always have before." Jacob stared at her for a moment, and Margaret thought she saw something shift in his expression. Maybe it was respect for her honesty, or maybe just pity for her situation. "The next train doesn't come through Millbrook for 3 days," he said finally, "and there's no hotel in town. I'll manage somehow." "How?" Jacob challenged. "Sleep on the streets, beg for food?" Margaret lifted her chin. "If I have to—" Jacob was quiet for a long time, looking back and forth between Margaret and his sons. Finally, he let out a long sigh. "You can stay until the train comes," he said. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not interested in romance or companionship or whatever it is my sons think I need. This is just temporary charity, nothing more," Margaret nodded. "I understand completely. There's a small room off the kitchen that used to be the hired man's." "Quarters," Jacob continued. "It's not much, but it has a bed and a washstand. You can stay there." Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "I'm grateful for your kindness." Jacob's expression softened just slightly. "It's not kindness, it's necessity. I can't in good conscience send a woman back to town with nowhere to stay." Samuel and Benjamin looked relieved that their father was at least willing to let Margaret stay, even if it wasn't the outcome they had hoped for. Benjamin picked up Margaret's suitcase and started toward the house. "I'll show you where the room is," he said as they walked toward the front door. Margaret got her first look at the inside of the Hayes house. The front hallway was clean but sparse, with wooden floors that creaked under their feet. Family photographs lined one wall, and Margaret caught a glimpse of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile in several of them. That must have been Jacob's wife, Catherine. The kitchen was large and functional, with a big wood-burning stove, a long wooden table, and cabinets that looked hand-built. But like everything else about the house, it felt cold and empty. There were no flowers on the table, no pleasant smells of cooking food, no signs that anyone took joy in spending time there. Benjamin led her to a door at the back of the kitchen and opened it to reveal a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the barn. It wasn't fancy, but it was more than Margaret had expected. "The wash basin is there," Benjamin said, pointing to a corner of the room, "and there's a pump for water right outside the kitchen door." "It's perfect," Margaret said, setting her suitcase on the bed. "Thank you." Benjamin hesitated in the doorway. "Miss Sullivan, I hope you won't judge Pa too harshly for how he acted out there. He's not usually so ... "Cold?" Margaret suggested. "Unfriendly," Benjamin finished diplomatically. "He used to be different, warmer. He laughed a lot before Ma died." Margaret looked around the small room that would be her home for the next 3 days. "Grief changes people," she said. I understand that. Do you really? Benjamin asked hopefully. Margaret thought about her own parents, about the pain of losing them and the long, difficult months that followed. I lost both my parents within 2 years of each other, she said. I know what it's like to feel like the world has ended and you're supposed to keep living in it anyway. Benjamin's face brightened. Then maybe you do understand. Maybe you can help him see that life doesn't have to end just because someone you love dies. Margaret looked out the window toward the barn, where she could see Jacob leading another horse into its stall. His movements were efficient but mechanical, like he was going through the motions without really thinking about what he was doing. I'm only going to be here for 3 days, she reminded Benjamin. That's not enough time to help anyone heal from that kind of loss. Maybe not, Benjamin said. But maybe it's enough time to plant a seed. Ma always said that's how the best things grow, slowly, with patience and care. After Benjamin left her alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her temporary home. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of voices in the kitchen as Jacob talked to his sons. She couldn't make out the words, but she could tell from the tone that it wasn't a happy conversation. She wondered what she had gotten herself into. Jacob Hayes was clearly a man carrying a deep wound, and his sons were 2 young men who loved their father enough to risk his anger to try to help him. She was just a woman with nowhere else to go, caught in the middle of a family struggle with grief and hope. Margaret unpacked her few belongings and tried not to think about what would happen in 3 days when the train came. For now, she had a roof over her head and a safe place to sleep. Tomorrow, she would start figuring out how to survive in this new place. Even if it was only temporary, outside her window, she could see Jacob walking back toward the house, his shoulders still bent under the weight of whatever burden he carried. Margaret found herself wondering what he had been like before his wife died, when he laughed and danced and helped with the cooking. It was hard to imagine that version of him, existing in the same body as the cold, distant man she had just met, but people weren't always what they seemed on the surface. Margaret had learned that lesson the hard way with Thomas Crawford. Maybe, if she was very careful and very respectful of Jacob's boundaries, she could learn something about the real man hiding underneath all that grief and anger, or maybe she would just spend 3 quiet days in this little room before moving on to whatever came next. Either way, she was grateful to have a safe place to rest while she figured out her future. Margaret woke up before dawn to the sound of boots moving around in the kitchen. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Hayes household starting their day. Through her small window she could see the first pale light of morning creeping across the sky. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a dark blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable. When she opened her door and stepped into the kitchen, she found Jacob standing at the stove with his back to her, making coffee in a battered metal pot. "Good morning," she said quietly, not wanting to startle him. Jacob glanced over his shoulder. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral. "Coffee will be ready in a minute." Margaret looked around the kitchen in the morning light and saw things she hadn't noticed the night before. Dirty dishes were stacked beside the wash basin. The floor needed sweeping. The windows were dusty, and cobwebs hung in the corners near the ceiling. "Would you like me to make breakfast?" she offered. Jacob poured himself a cup of coffee and took a sip before answering. "We usually just have coffee and whatever bread is left from the day before." Margaret looked at the half-loaf of stale bread sitting on the counter. It was hard as a rock and probably 3 days old. "What about eggs? Do you keep chickens?" "There's a hen house behind the barn," Jacob said, "but we haven't bothered with it much lately." "May I gather some eggs and make a proper breakfast? I'd like to do something useful to earn my keep while I'm here." Jacob studied her face for a moment, as if trying to figure out if she had some hidden motive. Finally, he nodded. "Suit yourself. The boys will be down soon. They'll be hungry after the morning chores." Margaret found an old basket in the pantry and made her way outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, and she could smell the scent of hay and livestock from the barn. It was so different from the smoky, crowded streets of Boston, the hen house. was small but well-built, though it clearly hadn't been cleaned in a while. A dozen red hens pecked around in the dirt, and Margaret was pleased to find 8 fresh eggs in the nesting boxes. She also noticed that the chickens' water containers were nearly empty when she returned to the kitchen with the eggs she found. Samuel and Benjamin sitting at the table with their father, all 3 men nursing cups of coffee in silence. They looked up when she came in. "I found some eggs," Margaret announced, setting the basket on the counter. "I'll have breakfast ready in a few minutes." "You don't have to do that," Samuel said, but she could see he was pleased by the offer. "I want to," Margaret replied, already. Looking through the pantry for supplies, she found some flour, a bit of salt, and a small jar of bacon grease. It wasn't much, but she could work with it. As she cracked eggs into a bowl and mixed up a simple batter for pancakes, Margaret was aware that the 3 men were watching her. She tried to ignore their attention and focus on her cooking, but she could feel the tension in the room. "The chickens were thirsty," she said as she heated the bacon grease in a large iron skillet. "I filled their water containers while I was out there." "We usually do that," Benjamin said, sounding embarrassed. "I'm sure you do," Margaret said diplomatically. "I just happened to notice they were low." She poured the first pancake into the hot skillet and was pleased to hear it sizzle properly. The smell of cooking food began to fill the kitchen, and she noticed Jacob glance toward the stove with what might have been interest. "Ma used to make pancakes every Sunday morning," Samuel said quietly. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the pancake cooking. Margaret could feel the weight of that statement hanging in the air. She carefully flipped the pancake and started pouring another one. She added cinnamon to hers. Benjamin added, "Do we have any cinnamon, Pa?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I don't." "No, look in the spice box if you want." Benjamin found a small tin of cinnamon that was probably 2 years old, but Margaret sprinkled a little into the remaining batter anyway. The smell that rose from the pan when she poured the next pancake was warm and homey. When she set a plate of hot pancakes in front of each man, they ate with more enthusiasm than she had expected. Even Jacob cleaned his plate, though he didn't comment on the food. "These are really good," Samuel said. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan." "It was my pleasure," Margaret replied, and she meant it. It felt good to be useful again, to have something to contribute. After breakfast, the men headed out to begin their daily work on the ranch. Margaret cleared the table and washed the dishes, then looked around the kitchen with fresh eyes. The room had good bones, solid wooden cabinets, a large work table, plenty of storage. But it felt cold and unloved. She started with the windows, washing them until they sparkled in the morning sun. Then she swept the floor and scrubbed the work surfaces. She found some wildflowers growing near the creek and picked a small bunch. Tio put in a jar on the table. By mid-morning, Margaret had discovered something that made her heart sink. The vegetable garden behind the house was completely overgrown with weeds. What had once been neat rows of vegetables was now a tangle of wild plants and dead vines. She was standing at the edge of the garden, trying to figure out if anything could be salvaged when Benjamin found her. "Ma's garden," he said sadly. She was so proud of it. She grew the best tomatoes in the county. "When did you stop tending it?" Margaret asked. "Right after she died. Pa said there was no point in keeping it up when she wasn't there to enjoy it." Margaret looked at the mess of weeds and dead plants. There might still be some good soil underneath all this. It's late in the season, but we could probably still grow some winter vegetables. "You know about gardening?" "My mother taught me. We had a small plot behind our house in Boston. We grew most of our own vegetables because we couldn't afford to buy them at the market." Benjamin's face brightened. "Would you want to try to fix it? If Pa doesn't mind?" Margaret considered this carefully. She was only going to be here for 2 more days. Starting a garden project didn't make much sense, but something about the abandoned garden made her sad. It seemed like such a waste to let it stay ruined. "I could at least pull some of the weeds," she said. "Clear out the dead plants. Make it look better, even if there's no time to plant anything new." "I'll help you," Benjamin offered eagerly. "I remember some of what Mai taught me about gardening." They spent the rest of the morning working, side by side in the garden. Benjamin proved to be a willing helper, though it was clear he hadn't done much gardening since his mother died. Margaret found herself telling him stories about her own mother as they worked, and Benjamin shared memories of his mother's garden. She used to sing while she worked out here, Benjamin said as he pulled up a particularly stubborn weed. She said plants grew better when they heard music. My mother used to say the same thing, Margaret laughed. She claimed her carrots were the sweetest in the neighborhood because she sang lullabies to them. They were so absorbed in their work that they didn't notice Jacob approaching until his shadow fell across the garden. Margaret looked up to find him standing at the edge of the plot, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked. And his voice was dangerously quiet. Margaret's heart sank. She should have asked permission before touching his wife's garden. "I'm sorry," she said, standing up and brushing dirt from her hands. "I should have asked before I started working here." "Yes, you should have," Jacob said coldly. Benjamin scrambled to his feet. "Pa, it was my idea. Miss Sullivan was just trying." "To help? With what?" Jacob demanded. "This garden died 3 years ago. There's no bringing it back." "But there could be," Margaret said quietly. "The soil is still good underneath the weeds. With a little work, it could be productive again." Jacob's eyes flashed with anger. "My wife spent 10 years building this garden. She knew every plant, every inch of soil. What makes you think you can just waltz in here and fix it in 2 days?" Margaret felt her own temper rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't think I can fix it in 2 days. I was just trying to clean it up a little, make it look less abandoned." "Maybe I want it to look abandoned," Jacob said harshly. "Maybe some things are meant to stay broken." The three of them stood there in uncomfortable silence. Margaret could see the pain in Jacob's eyes, the way he was struggling with emotions he didn't want to feel. She also saw Benjamin watching his father with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "You're right," Margaret said finally. "I'm sorry. I overstepped. I'll stop working here." She started to walk back toward the house, but Jacob's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, and when she turned around, his expression had softened slightly. It's hard to see people working in her garden, but Benjamin's right. It does look better already." Margaret nodded, not sure what to say. "You can keep working on it if you want," Jacob said reluctantly. "Just don't expect miracles. Some things can't be brought back to life." As Margaret watched him walk away toward the barn, she wondered if he was talking about the garden or about himself. Either way, she had 2 more days to find out. Margaret woke up on her second morning at the ranch to the sound of wind howling around the house. When she looked out her small window, she could barely see the barn through the swirling snow. What had been a clear, crisp autumn day yesterday had turned into an early winter storm overnight. She dressed quickly and hurried into the kitchen, where she found Jacob standing at the window with a worried expression on his face. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough," Jacob replied without turning around. "This kind of storm can last for days. The boys are already out checking on the cattle, making sure they can get to shelter." Margaret looked out at the white landscape, where the snow was falling so heavily she could barely make out the fence posts. "Will they be all right out there?" "Samuel and Benjamin know what they're doing," Jacob said. "But it's going to be a long day." Margaret busied herself making breakfast, preparing extra food in case the twins came back cold and hungry. As she worked, she was aware of Jacob moving restlessly around the kitchen, checking the windows and adding wood to the fire. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked. Jacob looked at her for a moment, and she could see him considering whether to accept her offer. "The storm might bring down tree branches," he said finally. "If the power lines get damaged, we could lose electricity. There are oil lamps in the pantry and extra blankets in the upstairs closet." Margaret spent the morning gathering supplies and preparing for the possibility of a long, cold night. She found herself working alongside Jacob, and she noticed that he seemed less tense when he had practical tasks to focus on. The twins returned around noon, stomping snow off their boots and shaking ice from their coats. Their faces were red with cold, but they looked satisfied with their work. All the cattle are safe, Samuel reported as Margaret handed him a cup of hot coffee. We got them into the winter pasture where there's better shelter. Good, Jacob said. What about the fences? A few posts are loose, but nothing we can't fix when the storm passes, Benjamin said. The creek isn't frozen yet, so the animals have water. Margaret served them a hot lunch of soup and fresh bread, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the conversation around the table felt almost normal. The twins talked about their morning's work, and Jacob listened without the strained silence that usually marked their meals. As the afternoon wore on, the storm grew worse. The wind rattled the windows, and the snow piled higher and higher against the house. Margaret found herself trapped inside with 3 men she barely knew, and she wondered how they would all manage to get along in such close quarters. But as evening approached, something unexpected happened. The 4 of them naturally fell into a comfortable routine. Margaret mended a tear in Benjamin's coat while he carved a new handle for a broken tool. Samuel worked on updating the ranch's account books, and Jacob sat by the fire, cleaning and oiling a saddle that had seen better days. Tell me about the ranch, Margaret said as she worked. How long has your family owned it? My father bought the land 30 years ago, Jacob said, not looking up from his work. It was just empty grassland then. He and my mother built the first cabin where the barn stands now. Ma always said Grandpa chose this spot because of the view of the mountains, Samuel added. She loved to sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sunset behind the peaks. Margaret looked toward the windows, where the snow was still falling steadily. It must be beautiful when the weather is clear. It is, Benjamin said softly. Ma used to say it was the most beautiful place on earth. Jacob's hands stilled on the saddle, and Margaret could see the familiar tension returning to his shoulders at the mention of his late wife. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman, Margaret said gently. She was, Jacob said quietly. She could find something beautiful in any day, no matter how hard things got. Even during the worst droughts or the coldest winters, she never complained. It was the most Jacob had said about his wife since Margaret arrived, and she could hear the love and loss in his voice. What was her favorite thing about living here? Margaret asked. Jacob was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, the sunrise. She got up early every morning just to watch it come up over the hills. She said each day's sunrise was different, like a gift that was just for her. I'd like to see that sometime, Margaret said. Maybe tomorrow, if the storm clears. Benjamin suggested hopefully. As the evening grew later, they moved their chairs closer to the fire. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the house felt warm and safe. Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. Do you have any family back east? Samuel asked her. No, Margaret said. My parents both died within 2 years of each other. There wasn't anyone else. That must have been hard, Benjamin said sympathetically. It was, Margaret admitted. But I learned that you can survive more than you think you can. People are stronger than they know. Jacob glanced at her when she said this, and their eyes met for a moment across the fire. Margaret wondered if he was thinking about his own strength, his own survival. What was Boston like? Samuel asked. Was it very different from here? Margaret smiled. Very different. Crowded and noisy and full of people rushing around. The air always smelled like smoke from the factories. But there were good things too. Beautiful buildings, libraries with more books than you could read in a lifetime, music and theater. Do you miss it? Benjamin asked. Margaret considered this question carefully. I miss some things about it, but I don't miss feeling like I was always struggling just to get by. Here, even though I don't know what my future holds, I feel more tasteful. This place has a way of getting into your blood, Jacob said unexpectedly. The quiet, the open space. After a while, cities start to feel like cages. Is that why? You stayed here instead of moving somewhere with more opportunities? Margaret asked. Jacob nodded. I left once, right after I married Catherine. We went to Denver for 6 months while I worked in a bank. Good money, steady work. But we both missed this place so much we couldn't stand it. Came back as soon as we could and never left again. Ma used to say home isn't just a place, Samuel said. It's where your heart feels settled. She was right about that, Jacob said softly as the fire burned lower. Margaret excused herself to check on the oil lamps and make sure they had enough supplies for the night. When she returned to the main room, she found Jacob banking the fire, while his sons headed upstairs to bed. "Thank you for the extra blankets," Jacob said as she came back into the room. "If the power goes out, we'll need them." "Of course," Margaret said. "I hope the storm doesn't last too long." Jacob straightened up and looked at her. In the flickering firelight, his face looked younger somehow, less burdened. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. "I owe you an apology for yesterday. In the garden, I was harsh." "You don't need to apologize," Margaret said. "I understand why that was difficult for you." "Do you?" Jacob asked. "Because sometimes I don't understand it myself. The anger, the need to keep everything exactly the way it was when she died. It doesn't make sense, but I can't seem to stop." Margaret moved closer to the fire, choosing her words carefully. "When my mother died, I couldn't bear to change anything in her room. I left her clothes in the closet, her hairbrush on the dresser, everything exactly as she had left it. I thought if I changed anything, I'd be letting go of her." "How long did you keep it that way?" Jacob asked. "Almost a year," Margaret admitted. "Until the day I realized that keeping everything frozen in time wasn't honoring her memory. It was just making me afraid to live." Jacob was quiet for a long time, staring into the dying fire. "Catherine wouldn't want me to stop living," he said. Finally, "She used to get so frustrated when I'd worry too much about anything. She'd tell me to trust that tomorrow would take care of itself. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Jacob looked at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you for today, for making it feel less empty." "Thank you for letting me stay," Margaret replied. "Even though it's complicated." "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Jacob said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he almost smiled as Margaret settled into her small room for the night. She could still hear the wind outside, but it seemed less fierce now. She thought about the conversation by the fire, about the way Jacob's walls had come down just a little bit. Tomorrow was supposed to be her last day at the ranch, but with the storm raging outside, she wondered if she would be able to leave even if she wanted to, and the surprising thing was, she wasn't sure she wanted to anymore. Margaret woke up on her third morning at the ranch to silence. The howling wind had stopped, and pale sunlight was streaming through her window. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen, where Jacob was already making coffee. "The storm's over," he said, glancing at her as she entered. "Thank goodness," Margaret replied, though part of her felt disappointed. The storm had given her extra time at the ranch, time she hadn't expected to have. "The train will be running again today," Jacob continued, not meeting her eyes. "Samuel can take you to town this afternoon." Margaret felt her heart sink, but she nodded. "Of course I should pack my things." They had breakfast in awkward silence, the easy companionship of the previous evening replaced by the reality that Margaret would be leaving. The twins seemed as uncomfortable as she felt, glancing between her and their father with worried expressions. After breakfast, Margaret went to her room and slowly packed her few belongings. She was folding her spare dress when she heard the sound of horses approaching the house. Through her window, she could see two men on horseback riding up to the front porch. One of them was Thomas Crawford. Margaret's blood ran cold. What was he doing here? She heard voices from the front porch and then Jacob calling her name from the kitchen. "Miss Sullivan, could you come out here, please?" Margaret's hands were shaking as she smoothed her hair and walked to the front door. Jacob was standing on the porch with Thomas and another man she didn't recognize. The second man wore a badge on his vest. He was the sheriff. "Miss Sullivan," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "I'm Sheriff Williams. This gentleman here says you stole money from him." Margaret felt the ground seem to shift under her feet. "I'm sorry, what?" Thomas stepped forward, his face set in hard lines. After I left you at the train station, I discovered that $20 was missing from my wallet. You're the only person who could have taken it." "That's not true," Margaret sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never touched your money. Then how do you explain this?" Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather purse that Margaret recognized. It was hers, the one she kept her few coins in, but now it looked fuller than it should. Sheriff Williams took the purse and opened it. Inside were several bills and coins, far more money than Margaret had ever possessed. "This was found in your room at the boarding house where you stayed before coming west," Thomas said. "Mrs. Henderson, the landlady, turned it over to me when I asked her to check your room." Margaret stared at the purse in confusion. "But that's impossible. I never had that much money. And I didn't stay at any boarding house in Millbrook." "Mrs. Henderson remembers you clearly," the sheriff said. "Says you paid for a room but left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye." "But I came straight here from the train station," Margaret protested. "I never went to any boarding house. Ask Samuel and Benjamin. They picked me up at the station that same evening." She looked desperately at Jacob, hoping he would speak up for her, but his face had gone cold and distant. The warmth she had seen in his eyes the night before was completely gone. "Jacob," she said, her voice pleading, "you know I didn't steal anything. I've been here with you for 3 days." Jacob looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret could see him struggling with something. Finally he spoke. "I don't know what to think, Margaret. I barely know you." The words hit her like a physical blow. After everything they had shared, after the conversations by the fire and the gradual building of trust, he was willing to believe she was a thief. "Mr. Hayes," the sheriff said, "has this woman shown any signs of dishonesty while she's been staying with you?" Jacob hesitated, and Margaret held her breath, hoping he would defend her. But when he spoke, his words crushed her. "Hopes. She's been helpful around the house," Jacob said carefully. "But I suppose people can hide their true nature when they need to." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She looked at Thomas, who was watching the scene with obvious satisfaction. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him. "What do you gain by lying about me?" "I'm not lying," Thomas said smoothly. "You're a desperate woman with no money and no prospects. When you realized I wasn't going to marry you, you decided to help yourself to what you needed. That's not." "What happened?" Margaret said, but even to her own ears, her voice sounded weak and unconvincing. Samuel and Benjamin appeared from around the side of the house, having been drawn by the commotion. When they saw the sheriff and Thomas, they hurried over. "What's going on?" Samuel asked, looking confused. "Miss Sullivan is being arrested for theft," Sheriff Williams explained. "That's impossible," Benjamin said immediately. "She's been here the whole time." "Actually," Thomas said, "she spent her first night in town at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. That's when the theft occurred." But we picked her up at the train station that same evening," Samuel protested. "After she had already been to the boarding house," Thomas replied smoothly. "Mrs. Henderson said she left around sunset, which would have given her time to meet you at the station." Margaret could see the doubt creeping into the twins' faces. The timeline Thomas was suggesting was possible, even if it wasn't true. And the evidence, her own purse filled with money she had never seen before, was damning. "I need you to come." "With me, Miss Sullivan," Sheriff Williams said, not unkindly. "We'll sort this all out at the jail." "Wait," Samuel said desperately. "Pa, you can't let them arrest her." "Tell them she's innocent?" Jacob looked at his son, then at Margaret, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him wanted to believe in her innocence, but the evidence was too strong and his trust too fragile. "I can't say what I don't know for certain," Jacob said finally. Margaret felt her last hope crumble. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Jacob. "I understand," she said quietly. "You have to protect your family. I don't blame you for that." But even as she said the words, Margaret could see the pain in Jacob's eyes. He was torn between his growing feelings for her and his need to keep his son safe from any potential scandal or danger. "Miss Sullivan," Sheriff Williams said gently, "are you ready to come with me?" Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she turned to go back into the house to get her belongings, she heard Benjamin speaking urgently to his father. "Pa, this doesn't make sense. Margaret wouldn't steal anything. We've seen how she is. She's honest and hardworking." "People aren't always what they seem," Jacob replied, but his voice sounded strained. "But you like her," Samuel said. "We could see it last night by the fire. You were different with her." "Happier. That doesn't matter now," Jacob said firmly. "If she's a thief, then everything I thought I knew about her was wrong." Margaret heard every word as she gathered her few possessions. The twins believed in her innocence, but Jacob didn't. Or maybe he couldn't afford to. Either way, it was clear that whatever had been growing between them was over. When she came back outside with her suitcase, Thomas was already mounting his horse. He looked down at her with a satisfied smirk. "I tried to be generous with you, Margaret," he said. "I gave you money for a train ticket back east. If you had just taken it and left quietly, none of this would have been necessary." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, suddenly understanding something important. But Thomas was already riding away, leaving her with the sheriff and the Hayes family. Margaret looked at Jacob one last time, memorizing his face. "I want you to know," she said, quietly, "that these 3 days here have been the happiest I've had since my parents died. Whatever happens next, I'm grateful for that." Jacob's face softened for just a moment, and Margaret thought she saw regret in his eyes. But then he turned away, and she knew it was over. As Sheriff Williams helped her into his wagon, Margaret caught sight of Samuel and Benjamin watching from the porch. They both looked devastated, and she could see that they still believed in her innocence. Even if their father couldn't, the ride to town passed in a blur of cold wind and rattling wheels. Margaret stared at the landscape she had briefly thought might become her home, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. And in the back of her mind, Thomas Crawford's words echoed ominously. If she had just left quietly, none of this would have been necessary. What exactly had he meant by that? The jail cell in Millbrook was small and cold, with iron bars and a narrow window that barely let in any light. Margaret sat on the hard wooden bench that served as a bed, staring at the stone walls and trying to make sense of what had happened. To her, Sheriff Williams had been kind enough, bringing her a blanket and a simple meal of bread and soup. But kindness couldn't change the fact that she was locked up, accused of a crime she didn't commit, with no way to prove her innocence. "The circuit judge won't be through town for another 2 weeks," the sheriff had told her apologetically. "Until then, I'm afraid you'll have to stay here. 2 weeks. Margaret closed her eyes and tried not to think about what would happen if she couldn't prove her innocence. She had heard stories about women who went to prison, and none of them ended well. The sound of voices outside the jail caught her attention. Through her small window, she could see Samuel and Benjamin Hayes talking urgently with someone near the train station. They had ridden into town an hour after she had been arrested, and she had watched them moving around Millbrook, apparently talking to anyone who would listen. The jail door opened, and Sheriff Williams came in with a troubled expression on his face. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "the Hayes boys have been asking questions around town. They seem mighty convinced you're innocent." "They're good young men," Margaret said quietly. "But being convinced and being able to prove it are two different things." That's true," the sheriff said. "But they've raised some interesting points. For instance, Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house says you paid for your room with a $20 bill. But the Hayes boys say you only had $5 when they found you at the train station." Margaret looked up hopefully. "That's right. Thomas gave me exactly $5 when he rejected me. I can tell you exactly what coins were in my purse. The other thing is," Sheriff Williams continued, "Mrs. Henderson's description of you doesn't quite match. She says the woman who stayed at her boarding house had blonde hair and was wearing a fancy blue dress with lace trim." Margaret touched her own brown hair. "As you can see, I'm not blonde, and I've never owned a dress with lace trim in my life." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "The Hayes boys pointed that out too. They also mentioned that Thomas Crawford has had trouble with mail-order brides before." "What kind of trouble?" Margaret asked. Samuel says this isn't the first time Thomas has accused a woman of theft after rejecting her. Apparently, he did the same thing to a woman named Helen 2 years ago. She left town before it went to trial, but there were folks who didn't believe his story then either. Margaret felt a spark of hope. Can you find this Helen? Can she testify about what really happened? The boys are already trying to track her down, Sheriff Williams said. But in the meantime, they've gone to talk to the station master. Mr. Peterson has been working at that train station for 15 years, and he remembers everything that happens there. Just then, the jail door burst open, and Samuel and Benjamin rushed in, their faces bright with excitement. "Sheriff Williams," Samuel called out, "we found something important." "What is it, boys?" the sheriff asked. "Mr. Peterson at the train?" "Station keeps a logbook of everyone who gets on and off the trains," Benjamin explained breathlessly. "He showed us the entries for the day Margaret arrived." Samuel pulled out a piece of paper. "Look at this. Margaret's name is written down as arriving on the 4:15 train from the east. But there's another entry here, a woman named Helen Morrison who arrived on the 2:30 train from Denver." "Helen Morrison?" Sheriff Williams repeated. "That's not the same Helen who had trouble with Thomas before. That was Helen Williams." "But look at the description Mr. Peterson wrote down," Benjamin said, pointing to the paper. "Blonde hair, blue dress with lace, carrying a large trunk. That matches what Mrs. Henderson described perfectly." Margaret stood up, gripping the bars of her cell. "You think this Helen Morrison is the woman who actually stayed at the boarding house?" "We're sure of it," Samuel said. "And there's more. Mr. Peterson remembered Helen Morrison because she seemed nervous about something. She kept looking around like she was afraid someone might recognize her. She also paid for her train ticket with a $20 bill," Benjamin added. "The same amount that Thomas claims was stolen from him?" Sheriff Williams was looking more interested by the minute. "Where did this Helen Morrison go when she left town?" "That's the best part," Samuel said excitedly. "She didn't leave town. At least not on the train Mr. Peterson says she bought. A ticket to Kansas City, but she never got on the train. He saw her walking toward the hotel instead." "The hotel?" the sheriff asked. "You mean she's still here in Millbrook?" "We think so," Benjamin said. "We went to the hotel to ask, but the clerk said they had a Helen Morrison registered, but she checked out this morning, right after Thomas Crawford came to see her." Margaret felt her heart racing. Thomas went to see her? Why would he do that? Unless he knew her? "That's what we thought too," Samuel said. "So we asked around town to see if anyone else had seen them together." "And?" Sheriff Williams prompted. "Mrs. Watson at the general store saw them talking outside the hotel yesterday evening," Benjamin said. "She said it looked like they were arguing about something." "There's more," Samuel added. "We found the livery stable owner who rented Thomas a horse this morning. Thomas told him he was riding out to escort a lady friend to the next town where she could catch a train to Kansas City." Sheriff Williams was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through all this new information. "So you're saying that Thomas Crawford and this Helen Morrison knew each other, and that she's the one who actually stayed at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house?" "That's exactly what we're saying," Benjamin said. "And we think they planned this whole thing together to frame Margaret." "But why?" the sheriff asked. What would Thomas gain by framing an innocent woman? Margaret had been thinking about this question since her arrest. "Sheriff Williams, what happens to a woman who's convicted of theft? Where does she go?" "Well, if it's a first offense and the amount is small, probably just a few months in jail. But if it's a larger amount, or if there are other charges?" The sheriff's voice trailed off as he began to understand what Margaret was getting at. "A woman convicted of theft would have a very hard time finding honest work," Margaret continued. "She might be desperate enough to accept any offer of help, even from someone who had wronged her before." "You think Thomas was planning to offer to help you after you were convicted?" Samuel asked, his voice filled with disgust. "Think about it," Margaret said. "He rejects me publicly, then has me arrested for theft. When I'm released from jail with a criminal record and nowhere to go, he could offer me a place to stay in exchange for ... services." The sheriff's face darkened with anger. That's a serious accusation, Miss Sullivan. I know it is. But it's the only thing that makes sense. Thomas got rid of me when he decided I wasn't suitable, but then he figured out a way to make me completely dependent on him. And Helen Morrison was part of the plan? Benjamin asked. She must have been, Margaret said. Maybe Thomas promised her money to help frame me. Or maybe she owed him a favor for something. Sheriff Williams stood up. Boys, did you say Thomas left town with this Helen woman? That's what the livery stable owner told us, Samuel confirmed. Then, we need to catch up with them before they get too far, the sheriff said grimly. If your theory is right, Miss Sullivan, then we're dealing with something much worse than simple theft. What do you mean? Margaret asked. I mean conspiracy to commit fraud, false imprisonment, and possibly attempted kidnapping, the sheriff said. Those are serious crimes that could send Thomas Crawford to prison for a very long time. As Sheriff Williams prepared to ride out after Thomas and Helen, Samuel approached Margaret's cell. We never doubted you, he said quietly. Benjamin and I knew you weren't capable of theft. What about your father? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Samuel and Benjamin exchanged glances. Pa's been pacing around the house like a caged animal since you left, Benjamin said. I think he knows he made a mistake, but he's too proud to admit it. He's scared, Samuel added. Scared of caring about someone again and then losing them? When Thomas showed up with those accusations, it gave Pay an excuse to push you away before he got too attached. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. Maybe it's better this way. Even if I'm cleared of these charges, I don't think your father would ever be able to trust me completely. Don't give up on him yet, Benjamin said gently. Ma always said that the best things in life are worth fighting for. If Pa realizes he was wrong, he'll find a way to make it right. As the sheriff rode out of town in pursuit of Thomas and Helen, Margaret sat back down on the hard bench in her cell. She wanted to hope that the truth would come out and her name would be cleared. But even if that happened, she wasn't sure it would be enough to repair the damage that had been done to her relationship with Jacob Hayes. Still, for the first time since her arrest, Margaret allowed herself to believe that she might have a future after all. And maybe, just maybe, that future might include the man who had been too afraid to trust his own heart. Margaret was pacing in her small cell when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the jail. Through her window, she could see Sheriff Williams returning with 2 other riders. One was clearly Thomas Crawford, his hands tied behind his back. The other was a blonde woman who must be Helen Morrison. The jail door opened, and Sheriff Williams came in with a grim but satisfied expression on his face. Miss Sullivan, he said, I'm pleased to tell you that all charges against you have been dropped. Thomas Crawford and Helen Morrison have confessed to the entire scheme. Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. They confessed? Once I caught up with them, it didn't take long for the truth to come out, the sheriff said, unlocking her cell door. Helen Morrison broke down first. Turns out she's Thomas's cousin, and she's been helping him run the same trick on mail order. Brides for the past 3 years. 3 years? Margaret asked, stepping out of the cell on shaky legs. Helen would arrive in town a day before the bride, register at the boarding house under a false name, then leave money in the room to be discovered later. After Thomas rejected his bride, they'd accuse her of theft and use the planted evidence to make it stick. Margaret sat down heavily in the chair by the sheriff's desk. What happened to the other women? Most of them left town rather than face trial, Sheriff Williams said sadly. They had no money for a lawyer and no way to prove their innocence. Thomas and Helen counted on that. But not this time, Margaret said quietly. Not this time, the sheriff agreed. Thanks to those Hayes boys refusing to give up on you. They're the ones who uncovered the truth. Just then the jail door opened again, and Samuel and Benjamin burst in, their faces bright with joy and relief. Margaret! Samuel called out, using her first name for the first time. You're free. The sheriff caught them, Benjamin added excitedly. Thomas and that woman both admitted what they did. Margaret stood up and found herself pulled into a warm hug by both twins. For a moment she just held on to them, overwhelmed by their loyalty and friendship. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for believing in me when no one else would. Pa believes in you too, Samuel said quietly. He's just too stubborn and scared to admit it. Where is your father? Margaret asked, looking around. He's outside, Benjamin said. He rode into town with us, but he wasn't sure you'd want to see him after. After what happened, Margaret's heart began to race. Jacob was here? After everything that had happened between them, he had come to town? He came with you? He's been a mess since you left, Samuel explained. Pacing around the house, snapping at us for no reason, staring out the window toward town. Yesterday evening, he finally admitted that he'd made a terrible mistake. What did he say? Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. He said he let fear make him a coward, Benjamin said. He said he knew in his heart that you were innocent, but he was so afraid of trusting the wrong person again that he chose to push you away instead of fighting for you. Margaret looked toward the jail door, her heart pounding. Is he ... does he want to see me? More than anything, Samuel said. But he's afraid you won't forgive him for doubting you. Margaret thought about this for a moment. Jacob had hurt her deeply by not standing up for her when she needed him most. But she also understood why he had done it. Fear could make people do things they never thought they were capable of. Sheriff Williams, she said, am I free to go? Absolutely, the sheriff replied. Thomas and Helen will be spending the next several years in the territorial prison. You don't have to worry about them anymore. Margaret smoothed her hair and straightened her dress. Then, taking a deep breath, she walked toward the jail door. Jacob was standing beside his horse on the other side of the street, his hat in his hands and his head bowed. When he heard the jail door open, he looked up, and Margaret could see the pain and regret written across his face. She crossed the street slowly, aware that people were watching from shop windows and doorways. Word had already spread through the small town about Thomas Crawford's arrest and her vindication. When she reached Jacob, they stood facing each other in awkward silence for a moment. He looked older than he had just 3 days ago, as if the stress and guilt had aged him. Margaret, he said finally, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to say to you. Then don't say anything, Margaret replied gently. Just tell me what you're thinking. Jacob looked down at his hat, turning it over in his hands. I'm thinking that I'm a fool. I'm thinking that I let my fear of getting hurt again make me hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I'm thinking that I may have lost the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years because I was too much of a coward to trust my own heart, Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes, but she blinked them back. And what else are you thinking? Jacob looked up and met her eyes. I'm thinking that I love you, he said quietly. I think I started falling in love with you that first night when you made pancakes and brought flowers into my kitchen. And I'm thinking that if you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving that I'll never doubt you again. Margaret stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. Jacob, I know I don't deserve another chance, Jacob continued. I know I failed you when you needed me most. But if you're willing to try again, I promise you'll never have to doubt my faith in you. Around them, Margaret could see people gathering to watch this very public conversation. Samuel and Benjamin had come out of the jail and were standing nearby with huge grins on their faces. Even Sheriff Williams had emerged to watch the scene unfold. Are you asking me to marry you, Jacob Hayes? Margaret asked, her voice carrying. Clearly in the quiet street. Jacob dropped to one knee right there in the dirt, not caring who was watching. I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, and my best friend. I'm asking you to help me raise my boys and build a life together on the ranch. I'm asking you to teach me how to laugh again, how to hope again, how to love again. Margaret looked down at this proud, stubborn man who was humbling himself in front of the entire town to ask for her forgiveness and her hand in marriage. She thought about the 3 days they had spent together, about the way he had begun to open up to her, about the glimpses she had seen of the man he used to be. Yes, she said simply. Jacob's face broke into the first real smile she had ever seen from him. He stood up and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while the gathered crowd cheered and applauded. I love you too, Margaret whispered in his ear as he held her. I think I started falling in love with you that first morning when you let me stay even though you didn't want to." When Jacob set her down, Samuel and Benjamin rushed over to congratulate them both. "Ma would have loved her," Benjamin said, tears in his eyes. "She would have," Jacob agreed, his arm still around Margaret's waist. "Catherine always said the heart knows what it needs, even when the mind tries to argue." 3 months later, Margaret stood in the same spot where Jacob had proposed, wearing a simple white dress that the ladies of Millbrook had helped her sew. The whole town had turned out for the wedding, including Sheriff Williams, who had become a good friend Dot as she and Jacob exchanged vows in front of the small church. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had come west as a rejected mail-order bride with nothing but $5 in a suitcase. She was leaving as Mrs. Jacob Hayes, with a family who loved her and a home where she truly belonged. The ranch had flourished under her care. The garden was producing vegetables again, the house was filled with warmth and laughter, and Jacob smiled every day. The twins had become the brothers she had never had, and Jacob had become the love of her life. After the ceremony, as they walked back to the ranch together as husband and wife, Jacob stopped and pointed toward the eastern horizon. "Look," he sighed, "Catherine's sunrise." Margaret followed his gaze and saw the sun rising over the hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "She would have wanted us to be happy," Jacob said quietly. "We are happy," Margaret replied, taking his hand, "and we're going to stay that way." As they continued toward their home, Margaret knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. Not just security, but love. Not just survival, but a real life filled with hope and joy and the promise of many more beautiful sunrises to come.